Hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of Maine Cooperative Extension's Preserving the Maine Harvest webinar. I'm Lisa Fishman, and today we'll be joined by my colleagues Kathy Savoy, Lori Bowen, and Kate McCarty in the demonstration kitchen. Thank you for joining us for another Preserving the Maine Harvest webinar. These webinars are designed to correspond with what's growing in your garden and what's for sale from local farms. With the summer and fall produce in full swing here in Maine, we've got your answers for how to preserve these foods safely using guidance from the USDA. The mission of the University of Maine Cooperative Extension is to help Maine people improve their lives with research-based knowledge focused on issues and needs. Our educational programs include agriculture, horticulture, including master gardeners, 4-H youth development, food safety, food preservation, and nutrition. Finally, we want to let you know that the University of Maine is prohibited from discriminating on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, age, disability, and reprisal or retaliation for prior civil rights activity. Today, we will focus on pressure canning. This method of canning is used to preserve foods like vegetables and meats, including beans, soups, stews, and marinara sauce. We have our webinar set up so that you can hear and see us, but we can't hear or see you. We will have time for questions throughout our presentation, and you can ask a question by selecting the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen and typing your question into the box. Please use the Q&A feature and not the chat. Thanks for joining us. Now let's get started with a poll. We would like to know which of the following requires a processing in a pressure canner. Is it jams, tomatoes, green beans, applesauce, or I'm really not sure? And you can go ahead and do your voting right now. We have a few more seconds for that. You can select whichever one you think is the best one. Excellent. We have everyone having voted, and most of people have selected green beans. A majority of people selected the green beans, and a good number of people also selected tomatoes. Well, we are going to find out a little bit more about what the right answer is, and we're going to let Kate tell you a little bit more about that. We are going to jump right into the pressure canning demonstration because that takes the longest to complete, and then we'll backtrack and cover some basic canning information on pressure canning, and then we'll keep going back and forth from the demo kitchen to one of us speaking so that we can make sure that we're keeping track of what's happening with Kate in the kitchen. Are you all set, Kate?
Thanks, Lisa. I'm excited I get to share the poll results. It's been a while. So the correct answer is green beans. So green beans are the product listed there that require being processed in a pressure canner. If you answer tomatoes, you're not too far off because you can process your tomatoes using a pressure canner and get nice high quality results. So tomatoes can be done using a boiling water bath canner and a pressure canner, but they can be safely done using boiling water bath. So the correct answer for which one of these requires pressure canning is green beans, because you can't safely process green beans in a boiling water bath canner. We're going to break all of that down for you in the next 45 minutes, but we want to jump right into the pressure canner because it does take a while, and we are aiming to show you as much of the process as we can this afternoon. So I'm here in the demo kitchen. I've got my pressure canner heating on the stove. So to start, I'm going to review the parts of the canner and the setup that I did behind the scenes so that you're all caught up with what I've got going on here today. We've been in the kitchen all day. We actually made our product yesterday and reheated it this morning. Which it was a fair amount of work to make this spaghetti sauce, so it's nice to break it up into 2 days. So I've got this pressure canner here on the stove. It's a 16-quart pressure canner made by Presto. It's the smallest unit that they make, so it's a stovetop pressure canner. It holds 10 pints. Unfortunately, I can't see the box to tell you how many quarts. Fewer than that. 7 quarts, I want to say, and 10 pints. And I'm gonna be canning a spaghetti sauce or a marinara, which is nice to do because it is a ready-to-go product. So you can can, like we said earlier, tomatoes using boiling water bath canner, but then you just have canned tomatoes. So you still would need to make it into a complete spaghetti sauce to put on your pasta at dinner time, whereas this is just a jar that's ready to heat and serve. So the pressure canner can deliver these nice ready-made products. So I made the sauce ahead of time. It's heating on the stove. I can certainly get into the ins and outs of the recipes while we have some downtime later. And then I have on the stove the pressure canner pot itself with 3 quarts of water in it. So the pressure canner also comes with a rack that goes in the bottom. I held it out so I could show you before I put it in there, otherwise it'd be too hot. But this helps protect the jars from the direct surface of the canner, which could cause the jars to break if you put them in there without it. Comes with the pot, so just hang on to it and make sure it's in there before you fill your canner with your jars. And then the other feature of the pressure canner is the lid. So this is a lid that locks on, which is a safety feature. So it will be locked if there is pressure built inside the canner. So you will not be able to remove it while there's still pressure inside because of this little L-shaped lock. So there's a bracket on inside the pot. And then in the lid, there's a little lock that pops up. So when the pressure is building inside the canner, it pushes the lock up and that engages the little L-shaped bracket in the pot. So it's holding the lid on. And then it's showing you on the outside that there's pressure that's pushing up this lock, and you should not attempt to remove the lid until this is not up. We'll go over that more while it happens. In the middle, there's what we call the vent port. So this is free and open to inside the canner. This is where the steam that builds from the boiling water will be coming out. And that's also where your pressure regulator will go when it's time to add it. Then there's a little safety plug. So this is a big favorite of mine. So if the canner were to malfunction and over pressurize, this little silicone plug would get ejected due to the pressure inside. And then it would allow the canner to depressurize and cool down without blowing the lid off. So if anyone has any family horror stories of seeing a pressure canner explode in their childhood, is likely due to an earlier model that does not have these safety features. So we do encourage that your canners are up to date. And by that, we mean like the 1970s and on. So they were redesigned in the 70s with these safety features. And then there's this gasket inside the lid, which allows for a seal to occur once it's put on there. And over time, this gasket could become dry rotted and brittle and crack. So you just want to check it every time you use it, make sure it's still in good shape. It's not accidentally melted from being too close to the stove or dried or broken. You can replace it if it is. I think that's it for the features of the lid. And then it locks into place by twisting, which again, I'll show you when we are using it. So those are the safety features of the lid as well as the function of it. And then again, I've got 3 quarts of water here in the canner. So that's, I don't know, roughly 2 inches. And your model may vary. Some have a fill line inside the canner, just like a little line etched inside the pot that tells you where to fill the water to. Other one in the book, the manual that comes with it, specify add 3 quarts of boiling water. So we've got nice hot water in there. I'm going to turn it up so that it's boiling. It's kind of just simmering now. I didn't want to start it boiling too early and have it evaporate. So this method is a little different than boiling water bath canning in that you only have 2 inches of water surrounding your jars. So your jars are not fully submerged in water inside your canner when you're pressure canning. So then to prepare our jars ahead of time, I've also filled them with water. So I've got them in like a roasting pan, a shallow pan that I filled, and then I put each jar upright and filled them with boiling water. So the jars are warm. They're going into a little bit of boiling water here in my canner, and my spaghetti sauce is warm as well. So the idea is to have everything be the same temperature. That helps the jars reduce the risk of breaking, either while they're being filled or once they go in the canner. It also allows your canner to come up to temperature faster because it's got a head start with all the products inside of it being warm versus having to heat something from room temperature. All right, so with that, I think I've reviewed everything I need to tell you to get into filling the jars. I can tell you about my sauce while I fill the jars because it's going to make about 9 jars. So it's going to be a minute while I fill it. So I've got my basic canning set up over here. I've got a cooling rack, a nice sturdy one that we can rest a bunch of jars on at the same time, on a dish towel because I'll inevitably spill, so to avoid staining the counter. I've got my jar funnel to fill the jars, my ladle. I'm left-handed, so the pot is to my left. My jar lifter, because they are hot now that I've got them full of boiling water. So I'm going to go snag a few and empty out the boiling water into the sink. We don't need it anymore. And then put the jars on the rack. How about we do 3 at a time? Okay. So my spaghetti sauce here just gets ladled into the jar, and we're going to leave 1 inch of half head space, which is the amount of space you leave up at the top of the jars when you're filling. And I'll show you how to measure that as well. So this sauce started as 30 pounds of tomatoes. We used a paste tomato, which has less water content. So that's advantageous because we reduced the sauce by at least half of its volume so that it's a nice thick sauce, about the same consistency as a commercial spaghetti sauce. So again, it's ready to go. It doesn't need to be reduced any further, cooked down to serve. So it's 30 pounds of tomatoes, a cup of onions, 5 cloves of garlic, and a cup of celery. And we are, of course, following a recipe. This one is from the So Easy to Preserve cookbook from the National Center of Home Food Preservation. And it did give us the option to add mushrooms, or you could add green pepper instead of celery. So there's a little bit of flexibility. It also has some salt and dried spices, a little bit of vegetable oil, and sugar. All there for flavor. And so we just peeled our tomatoes. We used a food mill to get them nice and smooth so that will catch any errant seeds or skins. Cooked it down, or we sauteed the other ingredients and then cooked it down together, all together, till it was reduced by about half. All right, so my 3 jars are filled pretty full, so I'm going to measure the headspace. When you're pressure canning, your headspace is 1 inch, typically. The recipe will tell you how much headspace to leave. So this is a headspace measuring tool. It has little notches on the bottom that measure 1/4 of an inch each. And so the step that's closest to the top of the tool is 1 full inch. So it's like 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch, and 1 inch. So I'm resting this on the top step. And like 1 inch is a fair amount of space, especially if you're used to boiling water bath canning where you're doing these 1/4 inches products or 1/2 inch. So I have to take out a fair amount. So that's to allow this sauce to expand during the canning process. All of the air that I'm leaving in there and that 1 inch of headspace is going to get pushed out as the product expands during the heating in the canner. That's what creates your vacuum inside the jar. So the headspace is very important to measure and get correctly. I've certainly met a lot of people who just eyeball it, but we encourage the use of a headspace measuring tool. And then you'll apply 1 lid each. So these are the 2-piece dome lids. Center it on there and apply your screw band until it's fingertip tight. So that just means using the strength of only your fingers to tighten it. But put it on there firmly. However, you don't want to risk over tightening. Yeah, jars are very hot, which is good. All right, so that's it for these 3 jars. They are ready to go into the canner on that rack that's already in there. We're aiming for 10 pints of sauce, so I'm gonna cozy them up next to each other up against the walls of the canner. And then repeat the process till my jars are full. Not too hot to handle for a short distance. All right. so I'm going to finish filling these jars. I'm going to load up the canner with them, and I'm going to apply the lid of the canner. So the idea here is the water that's in there is going to start to boil and produce steam. And that steam is going to fill the inside of the canner because the lid is on, and the only way it can get out is through that little tiny vent hole in the middle of the lid. So that's what creates the pressure. It's this enclosed environment. And then in doing so, the canner environment gets much hotter than boiling water, than the temperature of boiling water. So we've got a great slide later that will show you the temperatures that are possible to achieve inside a pressure canner. It can be 240 degrees Fahrenheit to 260 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's much higher than the 212 degrees at which water boils. Lisa's going to tell you why that's necessary for some of our favorite Maine foods that we like to can in a little bit. But the idea is to create steam inside the canner. And so then we're going to engage in a process called venting. So venting is allowing the air that's inside the canner to escape to ensure that you have only steam. So a steam environment is going to be much hotter than one that's mixed with air and steam. So we're going to do this venting process, and it's just allowing steam to come out of the canner for 10 minutes. And that is a necessary process for all types of pressure canners, regardless of the manufacturer. It is a good practice to sit down with your pressure canner manual and read through it. I did that this morning just to have a refresher course, just so that you're not trying to do it right now when you've got hot sauce and hot water and hot jars. You'll be like, wait, what was I supposed to do again? So just be sure of the general process before you begin, as it pertains to your particular canner. All right. I think, Lisa, rather than me trying to do both things at once, we could go back to you and I'll finish filling these jars. And then when I have something to share about venting, you can, when you can see the venting process, you could come back to me. How does that sound?
That sounds wonderful, Kate. We will carry on and let you scurry around in the kitchen. You're the one under the hot light these days. So just to recap a little bit about what Kate was talking about, and while we're waiting for that canner to get sealed up and to come to pressure, we will again recap how pressure canning preserves your food. So the pressure canner, as Kate noted, is a little bit different than the water bath canner. Water bath canner, you're going to completely submerge your jars beneath the boiling water. And here in the pressure canner, you're relying on the buildup of steam to actually process your jars. So that pressure canner is going to use steam in that sealed container to destroy any spoilage organisms that could be inside your canning jar. And it's that combination of steam and pressure, that 1-2 punch, that allows for the heat of our food temperature to go from between 240 to 250 degrees. And that's much hotter than a boiling water bath. A boiling water bath, water boils at 212 degrees. So you can see that the jump to 240 degrees is significantly higher. And that's the temperature that is required when you're processing low acid foods like your garden vegetables, like meat, and poultry, any seafood that you might be processing. So that are stocks, if you had any fish stock. So the high temperatures allow us to process our low acid foods. And the reason why we need to make sure that we have a high temperature is because low acid foods run the risk of allowing C. botulinum spores to develop into toxins if they're not properly heated. And it's this, these types of toxins can cause a type of food poisoning that's called botulism. And so we always want to be careful about the botulism in our lives. The high temperature inside the pressure canner destroys any C. botulinum spores in your jars and creates a vacuum seal, which together make your canned foods safe for a long-term storage. Now, the pressure canner is the only way to can your vegetables and low acid foods like meat or poultry. A boiling water bath is not ever going to cut it. And that means that it doesn't matter how long you put foods in a boiling water bath canner. You could boil for 40 minutes, you could boil for 4 days. The temperature is never going to get above 212 degrees. So it's critical to use the pressure canner for canning your low acid vegetables and foods like meat and poultry. So pressure canners have one of 2 different types of pressure regulators, and you can see them pictured here on your slide. A weighted gauge or a dial gauge, those are the 2 types that you're looking at. And this refers to how pressure is regulated. The weighted gauge, the one on the left, it has 2 little rings and then a base of a little nub. It's the weight that is placed over the vent pipe and will allow the pressure to build up inside. And when the desired amount of pressure is reached, then the gauge is going to jiggle or rock back and forth. And that's going to let you know that you've achieved the pressure point that you want. And it's going to regulate itself. Once you adjust the heat to allow that to rock in a rhythm, then you're going to just be able to keep your ear open to that, and it's going to regulate itself and process the foods according to the timetable of the recipe you're following. These weights are always accurate. They are pre-weighted and they don't need to be checked annually for accuracy, and they never need to be replaced unless you lose one. The other type of pressure regulator that you're looking at here on the right is the dial gauge. For this type of gauge, the canner is sealed off after venting, which Kate's going to walk you through in just a few minutes once that the canner gets to that point. And once that's sealed off after venting, the pressure is going to build. The pressure registers on the dial gauge that's mounted on the lid of the canner. So this gauge is going to screw right into the lid of the canner itself, so you can look right at it. And rather than being something that's pre-weighted, you'll use your eyes to monitor where the needle on that gauge goes. Again, you'll always be following a researched recipe, and you will process according to the time that the recipe indicates. It takes a little more practice to master the dial gauge. And one of the things that you need to keep in mind is that each year the dial gauge will need to be tested. And we do that as a free service at the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. And you can contact any one of our offices and bring your gauge in. And this picture you're seeing here is what our master gauge tester looks like. And we compare your gauge against a master gauge that has been calibrated. And we will let you know if you need to make adjustments to your processing time, or if you need to replace your gauge entirely if your gauge seems to be too irregular. And that, again, that's a free service to anyone living in the state of Maine through the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. For our friends who are joining us from another state or another country, you want to be trying to find your local cooperative extension office in your county, in your state, and they will provide the same testing service for you. We're going to jump back into the demonstration kitchen now and visit Kate, because I see she's got something to show you.
Thank you. So I finished, I kept my video on, so hopefully if you're interested on your end in Zoom, you could still see what I was doing as I finished filling the jars, and then did some little like jigsaw arranging. It holds 9-pint jars, so I was not able to fit this, or excuse me, 8-pint jars. I wasn't able to fit this number 9 in there, and there's still a little bit of sauce left in the pot, but we could freeze it. We'll talk about what to do with that in a minute. So I filled the, put all the jars around the outside and one in the middle. And then I put the lid on just by, there's these 2 little arrows. There's an arrow on the lid and an arrow on the handle. So you line them up and then you twist it until the black pieces of the handle line up. And so the lid is on there securely. So it allows pressure to build. And the water was boiling as I was adding the jars. So pretty much instantly when I added the lid, the steam started to come out strongly out of the lid through that vent pipe. So my pressure regulator has not been added yet. This is the venting stage. and it's for 10 minutes. So I've started a 10-minute timer to be very precise about venting, because again, it's crucial to get the proper temperature inside to allow this venting process to occur and force the air out, fill the canner environment with steam versus a mixture of steam and air. Also in this process, I'm moving back because it's starting to hiss a little. But there's some condensation, steam starting to come out around the lock as well, and that's fine. It's totally normal. Eventually the lock post will pop up and engage and let me know that there's a good amount of pressure built inside. Of course, I would not attempt to turn the lid on the pot, I would not attempt to take the lid off the pot right now without turning the heat off and letting it cool for a while. So we've got about 7 minutes left for our venting process before we add the pressure regulators. Like Lisa showed you and discussed, this is a weighted gauge canner. So this particular model has one post that represents 5 pounds of pressure. So if your canning recipe tells you to process at 5 pounds of pressure using a weighted gauge, with this Presto model, that's what this is by itself. Other models might have like a separate 5-pound weight, or I've seen one that's like a circle, and it on the face of the metal regulator, it says 5, 10, 15, and then on the side, there's a hole. So you would just put the corresponding hole onto the pressure regulator. This one has just the post for 5 pounds and then 2 rings. So our spaghetti sauce is being processed at 10 pounds of pressure. So we add 1 ring, and together those two make 10 pounds of pressure. We're at sea level. We're working here in Falmouth, so we're well below 1,000 feet of elevation. If you are joining us from another state, or if you go to visit a friend in Colorado and you want to teach them to can, or if you have a camp in the western mountains of Maine and there are some towns that are above 1,000 feet, you need to adjust your canning for the altitude. So water boils at lower temperatures at higher elevation. And so that means the temperatures inside the canner are not as hot. And so to compensate, you add more pressure, which will give you a higher temperature. Well, the same temperature, but you need more pressure to achieve the same temperature. So the takeaway is if you are canning this recipe above 1,000 feet, you need to actually can it at 15 pounds of pressure. So that would be both rings on your weighted gauge here. So below 1,000 feet, it's 10 pounds. Above 1,000 feet, it's 15 pounds of pressure. And so our little lock post has engaged. You can kind of see it against the backdrop of our dark kitchen. It was rattling around a little bit, and as it engaged, it got quiet. So as you're standing here listening, you might hear that. And again, just indicating there's pressure built inside the canner. You should not attempt to remove the lid, but also it is engaged to the lid so that it stays on there nice and firm. So that's a good check. If you're using a dial gauge, the concept is the same as far as increasing your pressure for higher altitudes, but the pounds of pressure is different. So for a dial gauge pressure canner, it's 11 pounds of pressure. And then I think it's 15 if you're above 1,000 feet. If you don't know your elevation, we have in Maine, we have every town and every county, the elevation spelled out. You can also do a Google search to find I think it's the US Geological Survey can help you find your elevation. Same if you're in another state. Just be aware of your altitude when it comes to canning. Make sure you're within, at least what bracket of 1,000 feet you're in. So we're still in the venting process. We got about 4 minutes. I've got my 10 pounds of pressure. When these 4 minutes elapse, I'm going to add the pressure regulator onto the vent pipe, which will allow the canner to start building its pressure inside. As far as my leftover sauce, you could freeze it like this. You could certainly wait until this batch is done and can another batch. I probably have another jar in there. I don't know that I would go to that trouble for 2 jars. So what you could do is freeze these jars. So let them cool down a lot. They're very hot right now, so I wouldn't put it in the freezer hot like this. But I'd say with the 1-inch headspace that you've prepared for pressure canning in this wide mouth pint jar, this could go right in the freezer. So I had this one in there, and I had a regular mouth pint jar still out, and I was like, no, I'm gonna swap them. So the regular mouth gets canned, the wide mouth can go right in the freezer. So we don't recommend that you freeze in the regular mouth pints because they could break. they run the risk of breaking. So you can use your wide mouth pint jar for freezing, or a food grade, a freezer grade plastic container, and use put the leftover sauce in there. A zip top freezer bag would be fine once this cools down. And then just pop it right in the freezer. So it's nice to have it canned, but I'm also fine with having a backup in the freezer. But yeah, it's very hot. And when you're pressure canning, we really recommend you use the recommended jars. This is that standard, typically the manufacturer you mostly see is Ball or Kerr if you're joining us from the Midwest or West Coast, with the 2-part lid. So I know there's a shortage of canning supplies with supply chain interruptions due to the pandemic, as well as an increased interest in food preservation the past 2 years. So we completely understand it's a struggle. I don't have any secret stashes of places you can go and find these recommended jars for. The lids are recommended for one-time use only. That's due to their higher risk of not sealing if you reuse them. But your gold standard is seal. So if you get a good vacuum seal on your jars after the canning process is complete, then that will ensure your safety as long as you've canned it correctly as well. I want to be conscious of the time too, Lori. So if you have people asking a lot of questions, just remind the participants as well that if you have questions and you want to put them in the Q&A, we'll start looking at those since we're kind of in this holding pattern. And I'd love to make sure I'm addressing your questions versus just covering all my talking points.
Thank you, Kate. We do have a few questions. The first one is from Marcia. And the question is, can you heat the jars in the oven to prep them as opposed to filling them with boiling water?
So we don't typically recommend that you use your oven to heat jars. These jars aren't really made to withstand the temperatures of the oven. And it's a different type of heat in the oven. It's a dry heat versus the boiling water creates a wet heat, of course. And heats them better. So I would just be nervous that they weren't thoroughly heated and you'd run the risk of them breaking. So my recommendation would be to use a boiling water method. You could also run them through the dishwasher and then pull them straight out of the dishwasher because they will be nice and hot. That could be another easier method that doesn't require any counter space or much work on your part. I'd be hesitant about using the oven. Just that's typically something we recommend people avoid.
Okay. Now about the lids, do you do anything to sterilize the lids?
Oh, great question. Thank you for bringing that up. The lids and jars, we don't need to sterilize ahead of time. The pressure canner process is very intense from a heat standpoint. And so everything becomes sterilized during the canning process. So no, you do not need to sterilize your jars ahead of time. And I just wash the lids and set them aside.
Okay. Do you need to go back? I heard your timer, I think.
The pressure regulator, and then we can do more questions. The 10 minutes of venting has elapsed. And so I'm going to add my 10 pounds of pressure, my 2 weights. I always tell people that this is like the scariest part of pressure canning because when this goes through the steam, it's going to hiss. And if you're kind of nervous about it, it might make you jump. So just to expect that, but it's very straightforward, but you just put it on and it contains the steam inside the canner. The weight is very still. I don't think you can see that very great. If I stand behind it with my light shirt, it's a little better. The weight's very still right now as pressure is building inside the canner. What's going to happen with this style of pressure regulator is it's going to rock gently. So rock from side to side as the steam pushes it up. Pressure builds, it pushes up the weight. It lets out a little bit of steam, enough to allow the weight to fall back down. And that happens repeatedly. This kind of build and collapse or relief of pressure, which holds it at a steady pressure and therefore temperature inside the canner. So it's a self-regulating pressure regulator that we add. And it's just the jiggle we're looking for. So the jiggle is then what cues you to begin your time. So my recipe says for pints of spaghetti sauce, it's 20 minutes of processing. So that's 20 minutes of jiggling. if you're using a dial gauge at 11 pounds of pressure, it would just be 20 minutes of ensuring that the needle on your dial gauge is at 11 pounds of pressure continuously. If you lose pressure for any reason, if you turn back the heat or something, which I'm going to do a little bit as soon as it achieves pressure, you would need to stop your timer, reset your pressure regulator, get it jiggling again, or get it at the right number on your dial gauge, and then start the timer again. So I'll talk about what happens after canning, or after our 20 minutes have elapsed, and when it starts jiggling, I'll point it out to you. So we'll fast forward in TV magic and say 20 minutes of the jiggling has occurred. What would happen then after my timer went off was I would simply just turn the heat off on the stove. This is a gas stove, and so turning the heat off will mean that there's no more heat source. If you have an electric stove, it is recommended that you move the canner off the burner. Do so very carefully. You'd have to lift it rather than drag it on your, especially if you're trying to use a glass top stove, could damage it. So remove it from the heat source, and then you're just going to let it cool. So the visual indicators that it's cool are this little lock. When your canner cools completely, the lock will drop. That tells you that it's cooled down to room temperature. There's no longer any pressure built inside the canner, and that you are safe to remove the pressure regulator. So once you hear or see that little lock drop in this model, you take the pressure regulator off and you wait 10 more minutes. And that's again to ensure that it's cooling. There's no rapid changes between the inside of the canner and the relative cool room temperature, which could cause all kinds of issues with your canned goods and interfere with their seals. So you want to let this cool completely, wait 10 minutes with the pressure regulator off, and then you can remove the lid, carefully twisting the lid away from and lifting it away from you so the steam escapes not into your face. And then you'll need your jar lifter to remove the jars from the canner. They'll be very hot and the product will be bubbling, boiling inside. Place them back on the cooling rack that you use to fill your jars and let them cool undisturbed for at least 12 hours and up to 24 if the seals haven't formed in 12 hours. This cooling is when the vacuum seal forms. And so it's important to not blow a fan on them, wrap a towel around them, try and dry them off or anything. Just let them sit undisturbed and then come back and check the seals. I do find like a higher seal failure rate with the pressure canning process than the boiling water bath canning process. I'm not really sure why that is, just more variables or, so don't be discouraged. You can always put it in a container that's good for the freezer and freeze it or reprocess it if it's a whole batch. And then your jars of canned food, just like any other canned food, are good for up to 1 year for best quality. And once you open the product, you want to store it in the fridge and use it within 2 weeks. The spaghetti sauce should be 1 jar for a meal, or you can freeze the leftovers if you don't plan to use it, because it will go bad pretty quickly in the fridge compared to a store-bought spaghetti sauce. Okay, again, I want to make sure we get to the questions, Lori. So what else you got?
I got some good ones for you. So this is a great question from Diane, because I think we can clarify the dial gauge canner and the one that you have there. So her question is, for dial gauge canners, would it not be screwed on until the venting portion is done? So just to clarify, the canner you have there.
Thanks. And so yes, if you have a dial gauge canner, this will be attached to the lid where the vent port is. So this dial gauge will just be in the center of the lid. And then in order to kind of open it and close it to create the equivalent of me adding the weight, there's either going to be a separate weight that you put over another hole in the lid, or a lock or a weight that you can engage that closes the canner up and allows pressure to build. So this one's just removed from a lid just for demonstration purposes, because typically it's screwed into the lid and you don't ever take it on or off.
Okay.
And so this is the steady jiggle that we're after. So you can perhaps see that it's jiggling around, chattering kind of, and it's doing so consistently. So I have the heat up to like on high. I feel you can turn it back to medium high. and I'll start our 20-minute timer, which I need to do on my phone, so excuse me. Okay.
Okay. All right. So the next is not necessarily a question, but a comment, and it's from Carol, and she lives in British Columbia, Canada, BC, Canada, sorry, and have had no success in locating a place to calibrate her pressure gauge. And she finds it most frustrating.
Well, we've been during the pandemic offering testing these by mail, so I don't see any reason why you couldn't mail it to us and we could test it and send it back. And so we can be in touch after the webinar. I'll have your information in the registration process. And I can get in touch about that. And just to clarify, we don't calibrate it. We just test it against a master. So we can tell you if it's off and how to adjust for it within a little period. If it's too far off and either reading too high or too low, you do need to replace it. We don't have the ability to calibrate them, but we can tell you whether it's accurate or not.
Okay. Another question from Carol. Any pointers for pressure canning winter squash, butternut in particular? And should I add liquid to the pieces of squash or not?
That's a great question. And yes, so the recommendation is to can it in cubes. And I can send you the exact recipe, but it will be like in a liquid, probably water, definitely water. So cubes of squash in water. I'm terrible at looking things up in an index and talking at the same time. So I'll follow up with you as well with that canning winter squash recipe in cubes in water.
Thank you. So we have a question from Joan. Would you please go over again with a dial gauge canner? How can you tell when to start the 20 minutes?
So with the dial gauge canner, you control the pressure and therefore the number that's being read on your dial gauge through the heat of your stove. So what you would do is put the lid on, you would vent it, you would engage the lock that allows pressure to build inside your canner, and the needle will start to rise. And so when it's, for this recipe, 11 pounds of pressure, when it starts nearing 8 or 9, you'll want to turn the heat back on your stove a little bit so the needle will continue to rise. And through, again, controlling just the heat under the pot, it'll stabilize out at a pressure, and you just want to control the heat to the point where it's at 11 for this particular recipe. And then watch it for half a minute and make sure it's steady. And then you can begin your 20 minutes of time. So this just gives you a visual indicator that you're at the correct pressure compared to the sound of this one.
Okay. I'm going to try to squeeze in a couple of more questions here really quick. Amber would like to know, have you mentioned about pressure canning on glass top stoves? I was told that you can't.
Yes, so I have also heard that it's difficult. A lot of stoves have a lot of glass top stoves have a built-in mechanism that protects the burner. And so it will cycle the heat. And I've heard from a lot of people, they might have trouble getting a full rolling boil even. So this is a pretty heat intensive process. And you might struggle to achieve the heat required to build the pressure necessary. So yeah, I understand that it is difficult, and the manufacturer will tell you, most likely tell you not to do it because it's running the risk of damaging your stove. There are pressure canners that work with induction burners. It's not an inexpensive prospect, of course, but you could purchase a separate burner that would allow you to use the induction pot on it.
Thank you, Kate. And I hate to cut you off, but we are just about out of time. I just want to assure everyone that if we did not get to your question, you'll receive an answer in a follow-up email, along with a list of our resources. And you'll get those resources as well as the opportunity to find out about a preserving coach. It is coming up on the end of that. This month is our last month to join that program, but you can contact Kate McCarty for more information on that. Now, we will be back next month on Tuesday, October 12th at 12 to discuss fermentation as a method of food preservation. And we can share that email with upcoming registrations, resources, recipes from today's topic, and information on how to be paired with your preserving coach. So thank you all very much for joining us today. And hopefully we will see you all on the 12th. Thank you.
Bye, thanks everyone.